Delta Force. Right, the voice belonged to Tyler Voss, and the two words carried the particular weight of a laugh that has decided not to fully commit. The worst kind. The kind that costs nothing to throw and leaves no mark you can point to. He was 22 years old, seated at the end of the long table in the private dining room at Hargrove Steakhouse in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And he had the easy, liquid confidence of someone who has spent his whole life being the funniest person in whatever room he happened to be in. He was broad-shouldered, good-looking in an assembled way, wearing a collared shirt with the sleeves rolled to show the right amount of forearm, and he was looking at the girl across the table with an expression that did its damage by pretending to be friendly. The girl's name was Marisol Reyes. She was 19 years old, a freshman at UNC Pembroke, home for the weekend for her cousin Brandon's 21st birthday dinner. She had said it quietly, in the middle of a conversation she had not started. As a simple point of information, her grandfather had served with Delta Force. She had not said it to impress anyone. She had said it because someone had asked what her family did, and she had answered honestly, the way honest people do, without calculating the social cost in advance. Tyler Voss had laughed. Not loudly. Quietly, the quiet laugh of someone performing skepticism for an audience. And the audience was there, all 11 of them, cousins and friends and the assorted company of a 21st birthday. A long table with wine and appetizers and the warm noise of celebration. The laugh invited the room to decide, believe the quiet girl, or agree with the charming one. Half the table shifted, not toward cruelty, toward comfort, which is sometimes the same thing. Sorry, it's just, Tyler spread his hands in a gesture of generous doubt. I mean, Delta Force. Your granddad. That's a little. He smiled. They don't really talk about that stuff, right? Kind of convenient. Marisol did not look away. She did not flush or stammer. She held his eyes with a steadiness that was not anger. It was something older than anger, something she had learned from someone. Her hands were still on the table. He doesn't talk about it, she said. He doesn't have to. Right, yeah. Tyler picked up his glass. It's just everyone's granddad was a Green Beret or whatever. It's a thing. No offense. He's not a Green Beret, Marisol said. He's Grandad. Someone down the table laughed, and it broke the moment, and the conversation moved on the way conversations do when they have done their damage and no longer need to stay. Marisol picked up her water glass. She did not say anything more. Across the table, her cousin Brandon was looking at Tyler with an expression he hadn't quite decided on. The private dining room at Hargrove's occupied the back half of a converted Victorian house on Hay Street, with dark wainscoting and brass wall sconces and the smell of wood smoke and dry-aged beef that Fayetteville's proximity to Fort Bragg had made commercially successful for 80 years. Outside, the October evening was cool and clear, the street carrying the particular mix of the town: military families, off-duty soldiers, the civilian population that has grown up alongside the most storied army installation in the country. The rumble of a passing truck, the distant sound of aircraft from the base, the clink of glasses. Tyler refilled his wine and leaned back with the relaxed authority of someone who has decided he has won the room. He looked around the table, counting his audience, confirming it, and then looked back at Marisol. No, but seriously, he said, raising his voice just enough for the whole table to hear, what is it with everyone's grandfather being in special forces? My buddy's granddad was supposedly a Navy SEAL. My roommate's uncle was supposedly CIA. Where are all the regular soldiers? Did everyone's grandfather secretly win the war? Light laughter from down the table. Someone made a joke about stolen valor and then looked immediately uncertain about whether it had been a joke. Tyler pressed the opening. I'm just saying. Delta doesn't exactly put ads in the paper. How would you even know? Marisol kept her voice even. He has his medals. Sure, Tyler nodded in the way that means I hear you and I have already dismissed you. But anyone can have medals. You can buy them at Army Surplus. He smiled. No offense. They have his name on them, Marisol said. And the citations. Right, he turned to the person beside him, a young man named Dev, who had the uncomfortable look of someone who wants to agree with his friend and also knows he is watching something he should stop. The citations. He turned back. Does he tell you what he actually did? The missions? No, Marisol said. Right, the word landed like a period. Because it's all classified. How convenient. He made air quotes around the last two words, and two people at the table laughed, and Dev looked at the table in front of him and did not. The table had gone the specific quiet of people who are watching something and have not yet decided whether to intervene. Brandon was 3 seconds from saying something. Marisol reached below the table with her right hand and found the bracelet on her left wrist. She did not say anything more. She had learned from the man who gave her the bracelet that the quietest person in a room is not always the person who has run out of things to say. Under the table, her hand rested on the cord. She did not look down at it. She touched it the way she always touched it when she needed something solid. It was a simple piece, a flat strand of olive drab 550 cord, worn smooth with years, fastened with a small metal clasp engraved on the inside with 2 letters and a number. She had worn it since she was 7 years old. Her grandfather had tied it on her wrist himself, on the morning of her first day of school, when she had told him she was scared. He had taken it from his own wrist, where it had lived for 30 years. He had said, "When you are afraid, hold on to this, and remember that the person who gave it to you walked into places that were only dark and came out carrying the light." She had not fully understood that then. She was beginning to understand it now. Tyler Voss had turned to his left and was telling a story about his uncle who had been in the Marines, 3 tours, Fallujah, which he pronounced with the comfortable inaccuracy of someone who knows the name without knowing the place. The table listened. He was a good storyteller. The room tilted back toward him. Brandon caught Marisol's eye from across the table. He gave her a small, private look. Not an apology exactly, but the look of someone who has known her for 19 years and knows what she is carrying and wants her to know he knows it. She gave him a small nod back. The door to the private dining room opened. Not with force. With the simple, decisive physics of a door opened by a man who has opened doors for a purpose for 50 years. The man who came through it was 67 years old and wearing a plain dark jacket over a white shirt and dark trousers, and the first thing anyone noticed about him was that he filled the doorway not with his physical size, which was unremarkable, but with a quality of presence that has no name in the civilian vocabulary. His hair was silver white, cut to nothing on the sides, and his face had the deep, settled lines of a man who has spent decades outdoors in demanding climates and has made his peace with every one of them. His eyes, moving across the room as he entered, were dark and quick and absolutely alert, the eyes of a man who still, even at 67, in a steakhouse in Fayetteville, notes exits. He was not alone. Behind him came 3 more men. They ranged in age from 55 to early 70s. They wore civilian clothes, dark jackets, work shirts, one in a flannel, one in a canvas coat. They moved through the door and spread into the room the way water finds the space available to it, without discussion or signal, occupying positions that, to anyone who knew what they were looking at, communicated something specific about how these men had moved through spaces for most of their adult lives. None of them were large. All of them were still in the way that speaks to people who have learned stillness as a professional discipline. The oldest had a white beard, close-cropped, and a slight lean to one shoulder that did not slow him. The youngest had dark eyes and the watchful economy of someone who was in his 50s and had not stopped being what he had been. The room, which a moment ago had been the warm noise of celebration, had gone quiet. Not because anyone had said anything. Because the quality of the air had changed. The silver-haired man at the front found Marisol immediately. Directly, as though he had come through the door already knowing where she was. He walked to her, around the table, and when he reached her, he bent and pressed his lips to the top of her head and straightened and held her face between his large hands for one moment. "Pap," she said, not grandfather. The name she had called him since she was old enough to have names. He looked at her. Then he looked, once, briefly, at Tyler Voss. Not a long look, not a measuring look. Simply the look of a man confirming the location of a piece of information he already had. Then he looked away, which was the most complete dismissal Tyler Voss had ever received in his life, and Tyler felt it in a way he would not be able to explain to anyone later, except to say that he had suddenly, unaccountably, become aware of how much space he was taking up and how little of it he had earned. His name was Carlos Reyes, and he had retired from the United States Army as a master sergeant after 22 years of service, 16 of them with 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. He had not told Marisol most of what he had done. He had not told anyone most of what he had done. He had moved in the years since his retirement into a life of complete civilian ordinariness, a small house outside Fayetteville, a vegetable garden he tended with the same methodical patience he had once applied to very different things. A standing Saturday breakfast with 3 men from his old team who lived within 30 miles. Tonight, those 3 men were behind him. Because he had called them when Brandon's mother called him. And when he had told them why they were going to dinner, they had not asked questions. They had simply said what time. And he had told them, and they had come. There were things Carlos Reyes had not done in 16 years of operations that could be named. There were other things that could be named only in the way that weather can be named, by its effects, by what it left behind, by the silence it created when it passed through. He had gone into places that had no official record of ever receiving American visitors. He had brought people back from those places who had been given up for lost. He had been the last American voice that certain other Americans heard before they came home, and the last American voice that certain enemies heard before they stopped hearing anything. The Army had given him, in the course of those years, a Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 4 Bronze Stars with Valor, and a total of 6 Purple Hearts. The medals lived in a box in the closet of the 2nd bedroom, which he used as a study. He had not opened the box in 9 years. His granddaughter knew the box existed. She had never asked to see inside it. The bracelet on her wrist she had seen. She knew what it was. She did not know everything it meant. He had been 26 years old, a young staff sergeant not 2 years into his first Delta assignment in Mogadishu in October of 1993. He remembered the morning of October 3rd with the specific, total clarity that the mind applies to days it has decided to keep intact, every detail available and present and unchanged by the 30 years since, as though time had agreed to leave that particular morning alone. The air had been the air of the Horn of Africa in the hot season, carrying the smell of the city, dust, sea, the cook fire smell of a city of 1 million people who live close together, and underneath it, the smell of something unresolved. Something the city had been living alongside for months and had not finished with. The helicopters had been running on the airfield before dawn. He had made the bracelet at Oro 520, sitting on the edge of his cot by the red filter light of a headlamp, cutting the cord with his knife because Trent had told him and he had finally listened. Michael Trent was the best operator Carlos Reyes had ever worked with. He was 24 years old, from Macon, Georgia, compact and quick. With the particular gift that the best operators share, he was completely unremarkable until the moment he was needed, and in that moment he became something that the word remarkable does not come close to covering. He had a laugh that started low and built the way a story builds toward its ending, and he could read a room, any country, any language, in the time it took other men to find the door. He had been in Delta for 14 months and was already the operator that new men watched to understand what the job actually was. He had told Carlos about the cord bracelet the week before, sitting on an equipment case in the hangar, cleaning his weapon with the patient thoroughness that was Trent in miniature. He said he tied one on before every mission because it reminded him to come home. He said his grandmother had tied the first one, a piece of kitchen twine, the night before he left for selection, and that the habit had survived even after the kitchen twine hadn't. Carlos had told him it was a superstition. Trent had said, "Yes, it is, and I'm alive, and the math works for me." Then he had gone back to cleaning his weapon, and Carlos had gone back to thinking he was right, and had spent a week being right, and on the morning of October 3rd had cut the cord and done what Trent did. The battle lasted 17 hours. Carlos had been hit twice, the first time in the left shoulder by a round that passed through cleanly and left a channel of fire that he packed and kept moving. The second time in the right thigh by a fragment that did not hit the femoral and so was not immediately his problem, though it bled with the steady, businesslike commitment of wounds that intend to become your problem if you give them the attention. He carried a wounded ranger through 600 meters of contested street after the ranger's team leader went down, the young man's arm over his shoulder and the young man's blood soaking through his kit, and he spoke to him the whole way. Not with comfort exactly, but with the steady, low narration of a man keeping another man's mind attached to the present, which is a skill that looks like nothing from outside and is everything from inside. He held a perimeter at the second crash site for 4 hours with 2 other operators and a handful of rangers. The forces arrayed against that perimeter were not interested in the perimeter on principle. They were interested in what was inside it, and in the calculus that had persuaded them the inside was reachable. The calculus was not correct. It remained not correct for 4 hours. At no point during those 4 hours did Carlos Reyes believe he would die at that perimeter, which was not bravado and not delusion, but simply the discipline of keeping one's attention on the specific task in front of oneself rather than on the larger arithmetic. You hold the next 10 minutes. Then, the 10 after that. Then the convoy comes, or it doesn't, and you find out what the arithmetic has been doing while you weren't looking. Michael Trent had been killed in the early afternoon, in the street outside the first crash site, and Carlos had been close enough to see it happen and far enough away that there was nothing he could have done, and the distance between those two facts was a space he had carried inside himself for 30 years, without it getting smaller or larger, just present, the way certain things are present, neither demanding nor retreating. He had been mid-sentence when it happened. He did not finish the sentence. That was the part that stayed, not the violence of it, not the suddenness, but the unfinished sentence and the silence that replaced it, which was a silence of a very specific kind that Carlos had never heard anywhere else and had never expected to hear again and had heard, in the way that certain sounds live in the body rather than the memory every day since. That night in the field hospital, waiting for the surgeon, he had held the bracelet in his fist until his hand stopped shaking. He had thought about Trent's grandmother, who had tied the first one. He had thought, the math worked until it didn't, and it worked for 17 years, and the math was not wrong. He had worn the bracelet for the next 23 years. When he put it on Marisol's wrist, he had told her, "When you are afraid, hold on to this, and remember that the person who gave it to you walked into places that were only dark and came out carrying the light." He had not told her where the bracelet came from. He had not told her about Trent. He was not sure he would. Some things you carry alone, not because you cannot share them, but because sharing them transfers a weight that the other person has not yet learned to hold. Marisol was 19. She was learning. The memory let him go. The private dining room at Hargrove's reassembled itself around him. The wainscoting, the sconces, the smell of wood smoke, the table full of young people who had gone quiet in a way that meant they had stopped performing. He was aware, as he always was when the memory passed through him, of the exact weight of the bracelet's absence on his wrist. He had felt that absence every day for 12 years. He pulled the chair beside Marisol out from the table and sat. His 3 men had arranged themselves at the near end of the table with the natural ease of people who are accustomed to occupying spaces without requiring them to be rearranged. Brandon's mother had appeared from somewhere and was speaking in a low, warm voice about additional chairs and menus, and one of the men, the one in the canvas coat, who had been a master breacher for 14 years and who now coached high school wrestling in a town outside Raleigh, was already charming her in the particular way that men who have spent decades being professionally invisible learn to charm civilians, completely, with full attention, making the other person feel like the only person in the room. Tyler Voss had not spoken since Carlos came through the door. He was sitting with his wine glass in front of him and his hands in his lap and the expression of someone recalibrating everything he knew about the evening. It was Brandon who spoke. He looked at Carlos across the table and said, with the directness of a young man who has grown up respecting his elders without being told to, "Sir, Marisol was telling us about your service. I hope it wasn't out of line that she mentioned it." Carlos looked at Brandon with the particular approval that certain young people earn without trying. "She said what was true," he said. "That's never out of line." He reached across and touched the bracelet on Marisol's wrist. Just a touch, one finger, the way you greet something you recognize. She turned her hand palm upward on the table, and he laid his hand over hers for a moment and then withdrew it. Tyler Voss was looking at the bracelet. He was looking at it with the expression of someone for whom an object has just acquired a history it didn't have 30 seconds ago. He opened his mouth. He closed it. Carlos looked at him. Not with anger. Without anger entirely, with the look of a man who has moved beyond anger the way deep water moves beyond the disturbances on its surface and finds no reason to return to them. He said, quietly and not unkindly, "A man's family is the truest record of him. What his grandchildren say about him is the only biography that matters." He paused. "She told you the truth. She always does." Tyler Voss said nothing. He looked at the table. Something in his posture had changed, not collapsed, but come down, the performance vacated. What remained younger and less certain and, for the first time that evening, actually present. He looked up. "I apologize," he said. "To Marisol. I was being an idiot." Marisol looked at him. She said, "Yes, just that." Then, after a moment, "Thank you." The dinner resumed. Food arrived. The men from the old unit distributed themselves through the conversation the way good men do in family settings, without dominating, without performing, present and engaged and letting the evening be what it was supposed to be. The oldest one, the one with the white beard, told Brandon a story about a goat that had nothing to do with military service and made the whole table laugh. The youngest one quietly asked Brandon's mother a question about her job and listened to the answer with the full, real attention that is rarer than people pretend. Carlos Reyes sat next to Marisol and ate his steak and said little. And when he spoke, it was to ask questions rather than answer them. And when people at the table looked at him, it was with a regard that had nothing to do with what Tyler Voss had said or hadn't said, and everything to do with what the room had understood, in the first 30 seconds after he walked through the door, that he was. 3 weeks later, Marisol was back at UNC Pembroke, walking across campus between classes, when she got a text from a number she didn't recognize. It said, I looked it up. Task Force Ranger. Mogadishu, I'm sorry I didn't know what I was talking about. She read it twice. She put her phone in her pocket and kept walking. The October sun was warm on her face, and the bracelet was on her wrist the way it always was. And she thought about her grandfather in his garden, moving between the rows with the patience of a man who has learned that the most important things grow at their own pace and cannot be hurried. And she thought, yes, that is exactly right. Some of the men who held the line for this country have been home for decades, and they move through the world quietly, and they let their grandchildren speak for them, and the grandchildren always tell the truth. If you were moved by Marisol's story of inherited courage and her grandfather's timeless grace, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. And be sure to subscribe to Veterans Valor for more stories of America's unassuming heroes.